Welcome back to our study, God in America. As we go back to consider the deep roots for how our country has held its view of bravery, courage, duty, liberty, and freedom to be the blessings and responsibilities granted by God, we have considered, and I am sure in many instances, revealed before your eyes, clear evidence from the founders' own pens and their words that their view of God in America was the very foundation for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as we continue our historical journey, I want us to also think about how future generations, if the Lord wills, in centuries and millennia from now, how will they view our country, our culture, our civilization? What might be some of the starting evidence they find to form their understandings and opinions? Well, if we think about how we have done the same thing for nations and empires and civilizations of past history, then we can start to consider what our legacy may look like. One of the first and sometimes one of the most important historical and archaeological evidences found comes from the cities, buildings, and monuments that are uncovered. These monuments point to what a civilization honors. Did they honor nobility? Did they honor bravery or leadership? Did they honor certain virtues or beliefs? The monuments, memorials, statues, inscriptions, they provide to us some understanding about the priorities and the purpose, maybe the deeply held beliefs. In some cases, small cities or sites uncovered can point archaeologists to larger, more important locations, maybe the center of commerce, the seat of government, or a capital city. So let's explore the United States, considering what our history, both prior and recent, would reveal about us. Are we a society that honors the place of God in America? All right, first, I want us to notice that historically, the capital of the United States has moved between numerous cities before officially ending up in Washington, D.C. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was the home to the Continental Conventions and U.S. Capitol more than any other city, especially for events such as the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. One iconic symbol of independence is the Liberty Bell. This bell was cast in 1753, and it served as the official bell of the Pennsylvania State House. On July 8, 1776, it was likely part of the bells that rang out to announce the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. Since that day, it has served as a national symbol of liberty and is specially housed in Philadelphia, near to where Congress at that time had met in Independence Hall. Although most Americans have probably heard of the Liberty Bell, and maybe even recognize its iconic look, most probably do not realize that at the top, encircling the bell, are words that are a direct quotation and verse citation of Leviticus 25, verse 10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. So there, on this 2,000-pound, 4-foot-tall bronze bell from a city and state linked to the very origins of the United States, is a reference tying two concepts that were honored in the minds and lives of its population: liberty and the Bible. While future generations may not know its history, how it became an icon of liberty and freedom and served to inspire generations, they would know that this memorial bell was cast to honor God and His connection with liberty. As we mentioned just a little bit earlier, the place where the Congress met and subsequently where the Capitol was located, it changed numerous times during the war. Congress would choose but also sometimes be forced to meet in several different cities. Some of these cities include York, Pennsylvania, Princeton, New Jersey, Annapolis, Maryland, Trenton, New Jersey, and New York City. It was in their brief time meeting in New York City when the U.S. Constitution was officially ratified in 1788. And then the first Congress under this new Constitution would convene in Federal Hall, where George Washington would take the oath of office for his first presidential term. Now, although the original building of Federal Hall was demolished a few decades later, if the current Federal Hall National Memorial was discovered today, you would find a statue of George Washington out front. You would learn the history of the location, briefly being the Capitol building of the United States. And you'd find inside an exhibit containing the original Bible used by George Washington when taking his oath of office. That's right. Just as we have seen in previous lessons, that George Washington had a great reverence for God, the Bible, and Christianity, the physical display of the Bible Washington used during his inauguration serves to highlight, if nothing else, what this influential man honored and how generations since similarly hold that same honor. But the nation's capital would begin to take permanent roots when George Washington signed a few years later the Residence Act of 1790, officially designating a new permanent capital city to be established and built on the Potomac River. George Washington himself would lay the first cornerstone of the Capitol building in 1793, in the city recently named after him, and in the new federal district named Columbia. Congress would subsequently hold its first session in this Capitol building in the fall of 1800. The U.S. Capitol building has seen an almost continual sequence of expansions, modifications, rebuilding, modernizations through its history. It was burned by the British in 1814 during the War of 1812 and went through the period of industrialization, the Civil War, the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, 2 world wars. But through that time period, it has been the permanent home of the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. If we begin to explore the current Capitol building, we find it is a large complex with various sections and chambers. In the chamber where the House of Representatives meets, we find behind where the Speaker of the House sits, engraved in marble above the flag, the words, "In God We Trust." If this room were found by future generations, they would find in this central, prominent, and overlooking position these 4 simple words, "In God We Trust." While they may not know that this simple statement was officially signed into law in 1956 as the official motto of the United States, and they may not have yet found examples of our money, bills, or coins to find that this phrase is struck and printed on all U.S. currency, but they would easily learn that in this important, legal, governmental chamber, what was held in honor by past generations of our country was a trust in God. And that is significant. Now, looking around the House chamber, we also find that there are 23 marble relief portraits hanging over the gallery doors. These portraits depicting historical figures noted for their work in establishing the principles that underlie American law. 11 profiles in the eastern half of the chamber face left, and 11 in the western half face right, so that all 22 look towards the full face relief of Moses. It is significant that in terms of law, which is the purpose of those who are meeting in this chamber, Moses is recognized as one of the most significant names attached with this concept. The law of Moses is often how the Bible describes God's law that he gave to the Israelites in the Old Testament. So we see both how fitting this forward-facing portrait is and also gain an understanding with the historical honor being given to the Bible. If we take a quick look at the Senate chamber, we find several engraved quotations over the various doorways. Over the east doorway, we find the Latin phrase "annuit coeptis," which is translated, "He," or God, "has favored our undertakings." Then if we look over the south doorway, we again find engraved the national motto, "In God we trust." All right, now in the central rotunda area of the Capitol, there are numerous engravings found on doors, paintings along the walls, and even a 360-degree painted panoramic frieze of historical events through the history of the first settlers and the colonies and the founders. In these engravings and paintings, you will find numerous religious references, from groups bowing their heads in prayer, to key individuals holding Bibles, to religious symbols such as the cross or a rainbow. In 1955, the Congressional Prayer Room was officially opened in the U.S. Capitol building. A joint resolution of the House and Senate, called Concurrent Resolution Number 60, authorized this addition in 1954 and gave as its purpose the following statement: "Resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, that the architect of the Capitol is hereby authorized and directed to make available a room with facilities for prayer and meditation for the use of members of the Senate and House of Representatives. The architect shall maintain the prayer room for individual use rather than assemblies, and he shall provide appropriate symbols of religious unity and freedom of worship." That our governmental leaders were given a specific place to engage in an action of worship and devotion to God is significant. What we find in this room is also significant. There is a stained glass window of George Washington praying on one knee with the verse citation of Psalm 16:1 located below him, and the words of the verse inscribed around him saying this: "Preserve me, O God, for in Thee do I put my trust." This nation under God, that phrase appears above Washington, with two elements from the United States national seal at the very top and the bottom of the window. The bottom is the eagle holding the olive branch and arrows, and at the top is the providential eye of God and the phrase "annuit coeptis," again meaning that God has favored our undertakings. At the lower left corners are an open Bible and a candle, symbolizing the light of God's Word. The U.S. Capitol building provides to us amazing evidence for God's place in America. As one of the oldest buildings in Washington, D.C., it provides the historical context for the founders being deeply religious and desiring God to exist in government life as much as their personal life. But as the Capitol building was also a work in progress through 2 centuries, we see that at least some lawmakers in subsequent generations continued acknowledging God in the public venue of government. Now, through much of its early history, the Library of Congress was located in the U.S. Capitol building. But in 1897, the new separate Library of Congress building was opened up just across the street from the Capitol. Today, as you enter this enormous library, now containing over 25 million cataloged books, you will find architecture that revolves around the idea of knowledge. In the main reading room on the first floor, there are 8 large statues above the giant marble columns that surround the room. These statues represent 8 categories of knowledge, each considered symbolic of civilized life and thought. It includes religion, commerce, history, art, philosophy, poetry, law, and science. All right, above the figure or the statue representing history are words from Lord Tennyson's poem In Memoriam, which read, "One God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves." If we turn and we look to the figure of religion, above that figure we find the words of Micah 6:8. "What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God?" If we turn and we look at the figure of science, above that statue are the words of Psalm 19:1. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." Each of these references embody the Christian worldview and contradict atheism and polytheistic religions like Hinduism or Shintoism or Native American religions. You find inscribed in Hebrew a quotation from Leviticus 19, verse 18, that translates into English, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." While it is true that throughout the Library of Congress there are many cultural and historical references, extending back to ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome and Egypt, and they include famous writers, Milton, Bacon, Brown, Shakespeare. But it is also important for our discussion that this officially authorized governmental library has many references to Christianity and the God of the Bible in the architecture and even the decoration. There are quotations of numerous Bible verses, including from the books of Genesis, Leviticus, Psalms, Proverbs, and the Gospel according to John. We can see the roots of the mindset that the God of the Bible is central to the concept of knowledge. All right, now let's turn our attention from the buildings in Washington, D.C. to the many monuments and memorials that have been erected to honor those who individually were a part of the fabric of our country or collectively gave to our current freedom. Running from the U.S. Capitol building westward is the large open park grounds known as the National Mall and the West Potomac Park. These park grounds contain many monuments and memorials, with the tallest and most unique being the Washington Monument. Standing 555 feet tall, the Washington Monument is the world's tallest obelisk, constructed mainly from marble. The apex of the Washington Monument is topped by a 100-ounce aluminum capstone that has on its east face two lone Latin words, Laus Deo, which translates, "Praise be to God." Now, ascending the internal stairway, one can see many memorial stones, donated by various states and cities, churches, and even civic organizations during the 19th century phase of construction. The stones abound with references to God, references to the Bible, to Christianity, to Christian morality. For example, the stone donated by the state of Kentucky reads this, "Under the auspices of heaven and the precepts of Washington." All right, the stone donated by the city of Baltimore reads, "May heaven to this union continue its beneficence." Using biblical imagery, one city in Maryland linked the religion of the Pilgrims with the birthright of America in the memorial stone that they contributed. And here's what it reads. "From the city of Frederick, Maryland, civil and religious liberty first proclaimed in the Pilgrim Fathers of Maryland as emblemed in the Ark of the Covenant of freedom, and the dove, the harbinger of peace and fellowship that guided them through the danger of the deep, have been secured in the birthright of the nation by the enduring seal of the Minister of Justice, George Washington." All right, in addition to the apex, the memorial stones, there are many artifacts deposited in a recess of the cornerstone after completion. These artifacts include 71 newspapers that ran articles commemorating Washington, and a host of other historical objects, a veritable treasure trove for those in the future. However, one important artifact preserved in the cornerstone that we need to note: the Bible. Almost due south of the Washington Monument and across the man-made Tidal Basin Reservoir is the Jefferson Memorial. Constructed in the 1940s, this monument stands to memorialize Thomas Jefferson, one of the central figures in the founding of the United States. From his role as a primary author of the Declaration of Independence to later serving as our third president, there is a wealth of historical documentation on the life of Thomas Jefferson. And among the founders, he is often referenced as being less religious, and by some, the claim that he was a deist. However, we have looked at numerous of Jefferson's writings and speeches to see he believed in God, the providence of God, and that the Bible was God's Word, all of which are contrary to the position of deism. Now, when we come to the Jefferson Memorial, it is again significant to look at Jefferson's own words through some of these same writings as he discusses God, politics, American liberties, and the future of our country. The first quote that is seen in the rotunda of the memorial comes from a personal letter with fellow founder Dr. Benjamin Rush.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man.
All right, as we look to the southwest portico, we find an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All right, if we look to the northwest portico, we find an inscription from a bill establishing religious freedom introduced to the Virginia General Assembly in 1779, while Jefferson was the governor.
Almighty God hath created the mind free. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion.
Notice Jefferson's phrase, saying, holy author of our religion. What religion was he referring to? Well, the religion of the Bible. Christianity. That's what he was referencing. At the end of this same inscription, we find one sentence taken from a letter with James Madison. Jefferson says this:
I know but one code of morality for men, whether acting singly or collectively.
Notice what he says. Here he states one code of morality, which not only places his view of God and Christianity as what he believed, but that it also had an exclusive nature for man's responsibility. All right, finally, as we look to the northeast portico, we find a compiled inscription from several sources.
God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
So the question is, was Jefferson a deist? No. Did Jefferson believe in God? Absolutely. Did he believe in the God of the Bible, who was involved in the providential affairs of men and was intimately connected with the concepts of liberty? Yes. Now, as we continue to investigate the heart of the capital city, we find as we look west from the Washington Monument an imaginary line running through the World War II Memorial, through a 2,000-foot long, 167-foot wide, shallow reflecting pool that ends near the steps going to the Lincoln Memorial. If we start at this western end with the Lincoln Memorial, then we are immediately impressed with this large monument, standing 99 feet tall, 190 feet wide. The monument encloses 3 chambers: The largest central chamber houses an enormous statue of a seated President Abraham Lincoln, 60 feet tall, 60 feet wide. But of significance to our consideration of God in America are the two side chambers, which both contain engravings of some of Lincoln's speeches, each of which is punctuated with references to God and the Bible. In the south chamber, immediately to the left as you face the seated Lincoln, is the famous Gettysburg Address, which begins with words that may sound familiar.
70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
This brief speech was made in dedication to those that had given their lives on the battlefield. But Lincoln eloquently turns the responsibility placed upon those still living by saying the following:
that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
So we see, etched in stone, one of Lincoln's most famous speeches, where he links a nation conceived in liberty and ends with that same nation being defined as being under God. As we've previously discussed, these two concepts were intimately joined together by the founders, and we see carried through to nearly 100 years later in Lincoln's day. But the longer of the two speeches inscribed on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial is found in the north chamber to the right as you face Lincoln's statue. In this chamber, we find his second inaugural speech, given near the end of the Civil War and addressed to both sides.
Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first.
All right, with almost 4 years of war now behind Lincoln, he spends some time reflecting on what had torn at the country. As we pick up partway in the third paragraph of Lincoln's speech, take note how these words, engraved in stone, contain numerous biblical quotations. At this point, Lincoln opines of both those who fight for the North and the South.
Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh.
Lincoln is not berating either side for their belief in God, but rather the difference between the view of man and the all-knowing view of God, who Lincoln describes as a just God. In considering the limitation of man's judgment, he quotes Matthew 7, verse 1 on judging fairly. Then, following his quotation of Matthew 18, verse 7, Lincoln connects the existence of slavery as one of those offenses man brought into existence. And he considers that the war was a woe now suffered because it was God's will that it now end. But he addresses that how or when the war should end was in God's determination. Listen to what he says.
Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether.
We can see two more references to the Bible, especially in Lincoln's quotation of Psalm 19, that whenever the Lord judged for the war to end, Lincoln's view, it would be righteous. But in considering the end, Lincoln looked to how the nation would move beyond the war's conclusion.
With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
As we bring our lesson on the national symbols and monuments to a close, I want to share a quote from the second President of the United States, John Adams. And this quote is now inscribed on what is known as the Adams Prayer Mantle in the White House.
I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
I hope that you have enjoyed getting to discuss and see some of the amazing historical landmarks, monuments, sites from this nation's long history. And there are two main points I want to end with. First, God is definitely not absent from the public and political activities that founded the United States. The generations that followed have recognized and acknowledged this fact through the monuments and memorials constructed, as well as inscribing the context in which the ones being honored lived. The second point I want to leave you with is the fact that this is only a portion of the references to God that are found across our nation's capital in plaques, inscriptions, paintings, murals, engravings, statues, monuments, memorials, and its buildings. And that this can be multiplied across the country through the individual states and their buildings, monuments, and symbols. Though more recent generations may have diluted the place of God in America, the hope of tomorrow, well, it simply rests with you. Will you hold a place of honor and priority for God in your life so that there will always be a place for God in America?